Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. My name is Brian.
And I'm Sopo.
And today on the podcast, we welcome Samantha Lomb. Samantha, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thanks for joining us today. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, my name is Samantha Lomb, and I am a historian and teacher of English because being a historian doesn't pay the bills. I live in Kirov, and my current work is looking at the 1930s in the Kirov region, but we're here to talk about my book on the 1936 Stalin Constitution.
For our listeners, can you just tell us, what was the 1936 Constitution and why was it so important?
Well, the 1936 Constitution was actually not really supposed to exist. In 1935, in response to socioeconomic changes in the USSR, the party and state formed a constitutional drafting commission initially to revise the 1924 Constitution. But much like the US with the Articles of Confederation, they ended up writing something completely new. That was submitted as a draft for discussion on June 12th, 1936. And the Constitution is, it's a constitution. It contains 13 sections or chapters. It covers things like social construction, describing the Soviet Union as a socialist state of workers and peasants, which is notable in that the earlier Constitution used the word trudящихся, laborers, and here Stalin divides out workers and peasants as separate, which becomes an issue in the discussion. But it talks about things like, the structure of the state, the different bodies of government, the rights of citizens, what else? How the courts function, the national anthem, normal, typical constitutional things. It is a bit more complicated than the US Constitution in that there are 146 articles, and that the focus of a Soviet constitution is a bit different than a bourgeois constitution. And the party members do actually address this when they talk about it. They focus on the Constitution as a codification of achievements of socialism, rather than sort of an aspirational document or guiding principles. And one of the reasons that you end up with the Constitution being rewritten is that Stalin in particular, but other members of the party, feel that many of the limitations on electoral franchise that exist in the earlier constitutions are no longer needed. In the 1918 RFSFR Constitution and then in the 1924 Soviet Constitution, members of former exploiting classes, kulaks, priests, former white guardists, are all denied the right to vote. And Stalin feels that many of these exploiting classes are no longer a political threat and that they can open up the franchise and codify the big gains that have been made in collectivization and industrialization and the march to socialism in one country. So that's why they rewrite the Constitution. And not only do they rewrite it, but from June to about December 1936, it is put forward for a 6-month all-union discussion in which the party and state organs collect feedback from its citizens about what they think about the Constitution, what changes they think should be made. Some of it is certainly considered. Some of it's kind of silly. There are a lot of people who suggest that they themselves should have a bigger pension, for example. There is a lot of confusion, I think, with the citizens about the difference between a constitution and a legislative product. Certainly, the party and state collect all of this material, and Stalin and other leaders of government like Kalinin get swodki, like reports weekly with highlights about the types of suggestions and stuff being made. So they are paying attention, even if a lot of these suggestions end up not being actually implemented.
In this book that you wrote, Stalin's Constitution, Soviet Participatory Politics, and the discussion of the 1936 draft constitution, I thought it was interesting how you really go into this process of how the Constitution of 1936 was actually written. There's this back and forth between a draft, between Stalin's interventions into the draft, and then you talk about how the Constitutional Commission ends up sometimes adding, sometimes retracting, sometimes expanding on different aspects for this final version of the draft constitution. But through that process, what I thought was the most interesting was that there's this way in which the Soviet constitution doesn't simply talk about rights that are given to Soviet citizens, but also has parts about provisions, things that people are provided by virtue of being Soviet citizens, as one aspect, and then a second aspect as kind of a view of what the Soviet state should or should not be. So could you just tell us a little bit about, what kind of constitution this was in terms of the structuring of rights for Soviet citizens, both in terms of the provision of material support for, say, the right to rest, the right to pensions, but also the right in terms of how speech functioned in the Soviet Union. And this is clearly not a Western bourgeois constitution. This is a constitution that outlines rights for Soviet citizens, some of which are material rights, like the right to rest. So my question to you is, how does this constitution differ from, say, Western capitalist bourgeois constitutions?
It's longer for sure. And it does provide economic rights that do not exist in, like, say, the US Constitution. Also, nicely enough, there's no slavery, unlike the US Constitution. Big plus there. But yeah, what you're talking about, I don't think is necessarily a Soviet idea, but there is this idea that as a citizen, you have certain obligations to the state, but since you are the font from which the power of an elected system comes, that people represent you, that power lies within the people, that the state has obligations to you as well. And I don't think that is something unique to certainly the Soviet Constitution, but it is perhaps more codified. Certainly there are within the Constitution a lot of interesting rights. For example, the right to certain personal property is codified when it talks about like landholding and collective farms and stuff. It is specifically stated in the Constitution that you are allowed to have your personal house, your personal garden, a certain number of livestock, and they actually enumerate how much livestock, like one cow. Several suggestions to the Constitution actually suggest allowing multiple cow ownership, because many people have large families and cows provide important milk and cream and dairy products for a growing family. And certainly like a Western constitution would not be discussing how many cows you can legally own. Also, yes, very much like the rights to rest, the right to have your pay. And also, Stalin certainly talks about the right to have the material conditions to manifest what we might consider more traditional bourgeois rights, so that you would have the right to access printing houses, for example. That, he finds that in many bourgeois countries, you have the right to freedom of speech, press, and assembly, but poor people don't have the ability to actually use these rights because they have no access to mechanisms of power or typing offices or halls. So the party actually provides that people have access to typographical establishments, paper for printing of newspapers and books, the ability to access new social buildings and to provide for the construction of new social buildings where people can meet and associate. And interestingly enough, they really, really want people to have the ability to be critical of the state. They talk about encouraging citizens to engage in criticism of the state and self criticism, and to really take a dim view of people that suppress this. And certainly, this is something you see throughout the 1930s. In the mid 30s, one of the reasons people get kicked out of the party, different party bosses and stuff, and then maybe even later arrested, is their suppression of criticism and self criticism of their anti party actions. So that's, again, not something you would really think of in the Soviet Union, that you want people to be vocal, but Stalin even views the electoral process as a way to engage in healthy criticism of the state. In an interview he has with Roy Howard on March 1st, 1936, Roy Howard being an American journalist, and this interview is published both abroad and in newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia. He addresses the issues of elections, and he says that there's not going to be multi-party elections. The Communist Party is the one party, it is the vanguard of the revolution, but he certainly wants multi-candidate elections. He wants, under the new draft constitution, for social organizations of all varieties, not just the Communist Party, to have the ability to nominate candidates. And this is something that people don't seem to understand. Most of the time in elections, you have multiple candidates and not all of them are party members. There simply are not enough party members to staff all of the positions that require people to be elected to. And you will see posters that talk about voting for a block of party and aligned candidates. So they are non-party members, but people who support party ideas. And he believes that these contests between different individuals would allow the proletariat to effect change in government and policy through mass participation. Specifically, he says, I foresee very lively election campaigns. There are more than a few institutions in our country which work badly. Cases occur when this or that local government body fails to satisfy certain of the multifarious and growing requirements of the toilers of town and country. Have you built a good school or not? Have you improved housing conditions? Are you a bureaucrat? And bureaucrat is an offensive word. Bureaucrat is somebody who just simply makes paper and doesn't do a good job. Have you helped our labor become more effective and our lives more cultured? Such will be the criteria by which millions of electors will measure the fitness of candidates, rejecting the unsuitable, expunge their names from the candidates list, and promote and nominate the best. Electoral campaigns will be very lively. They will be conducted around numerous very acute problems, principally of a practical nature, of first-class importance for the people. Our new election system will tighten up all institutions and organizations and compel them to improve their work. Universal, direct, and secret suffrage in the USSR will be a whip in the hands of the population against the organs of government, which work badly. Again, this is not something you really expect when you talk about the Soviet Union, but he was pretty serious. And so multi-candidate elections were designed for local people to get rid of the people who do not create better situations in their lives, who do not work for them, who maybe engage in corruption. And I think that certainly is interesting and perhaps unexpected.
That's actually a really interesting point, Samantha. Thanks for bringing that up. Isn't this often interpreted as often negative, as in people were denouncing others? Because the way it is written is like, it's not that they were criticizing the state or self-criticism or criticizing bureaucrats or things that are not working. Often it is told in this way that people were denouncing others.
I don't think in 1936, really. Um, and certainly the party encourages self-criticism and criticism from forever, seen as a way of rooting out party problems, bringing them to light, and dealing with them. So I don't think it really has anything to do with denunciation. Denunciations tend to come later. And there's a number of reasons people denounce each other. Sometimes it may be criticism of how a government functions, but a lot of it is personal. There's a lot of personal motivations behind denunciation. But this is really about not electing people who do a crap job in your local government, which I think is fair and reasonable. And unfortunately, a lot of the local bodies within the USSR did not function particularly well for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of these people were simply out of their depth. They had maybe an elementary school education. They had very few phone connections. Roads in Kirov were often unpassable 6 months out of the year. And your main transport was often the bicycle or the horse. You're not riding your bicycle in northern Russia for like the whole winter. So there's a lot of connections. There's a lot of problems with getting services to people simply because of infrastructure issues and being understaffed, your staff just not having the appropriate level of training. There's also a lot of people who engage in corrupt behaviors. A lot of them have drinking problems. A lot of them embezzle funds to pay for said drinking problem. A lot of them engage in what we call self-supply, where they take commercial goods that are meant to go to different stores or organizations and distribute them amongst their friends. So a lot of organizations, both party and state, do not function well, and this would be one of the ways to deal with it. Certainly, Arch Getty argues that when things continue to keep functioning badly and Stalin is not successful in addressing it, this is when we start seeing repression among party members, because the assumption becomes you can't really be this terrible at your job unless it's purposeful, and that therefore you must be an enemy of the people. And that's perhaps one of the reasons behind the repression campaign against people in party and state offices. And some of them really do make a giant mess. I've got some people in the Kirov Land Organization, the Oblast Земельное управление. And their job is to do things like set quotas for planting, keep track of how much land collective farmers have. Well, either because they surveyed wrong, or in some cases because they were taking bribes to artificially inflate the amount of forest land that was being cleared and added to collective farms. By the time you hit 1936, 1937, they are giving collective farmers planting quotas for land that no longer exists, that the collective farm doesn't have, that isn't clear. And the collective farms are then responsible for taxes on this non-existent land, which creates huge economic hardship and a giant mess. And a lot of those people get arrested, generally for being bad at their job and engaging in bribery.
So you talked about how the Soviet state, and especially some of the ideas of Stalin in this period, believed that there was a purpose of using popular political sentiments to fight against bureaucratic inadequacies. And that this is something that led to some of his views about why the Constitution should look the way that it does. And in your book, you also have this discussion that runs throughout about the relationship between sort of the regional party elites in Kirov and local officials and officials in the center. So you also have a discussion that runs kind of through your book about the relationship between some form of Soviet democracy and popular sovereignty, and then the needs and interests of the state. And what was interesting to me about this whole framework and discussion and investigation that you do is that there's a lot of agency on the ground of actors in shaping how the state works And sometimes the interests of the state and the interests of the people are not aligned, but in ways that might be counterintuitive. For example, the right to habeas corpus, for example, and the pushback from some of the people on this right to habeas corpus. So, could you just talk a little bit about, for our listeners, about the relationship between the Soviet state and popular agency and how that manifests in your study of the 1936 Soviet Constitution?
So habeas corpus is Latin. It literally means the body of the crime, but it is what we call due process, that you cannot just throw someone in jail without having evidence that a crime was committed and having their arrest sanctioned by some sort of judicial authority. Yeah, it is interesting when you look at the suggestions to the Constitution. Most people within the Soviet Union are not particularly concerned with what we would consider traditional bourgeois liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, just not particularly interested in this. Possibly because they've never had it under the czars, they've lived without it just fine, it doesn't mean anything to them. They are more interested in bread and butter suggestions, including and excluding people from citizenship rights and corresponding benefits, creating a stable and secure material world for themselves. If we look at the suggestions as a whole, as of November 15th, 1936, there are over 43,000 suggestions that have been gathered up and tabulated by the organizational section of the Central Executive Committee. And of the 146 articles, only 9 received more than 1,000 individual suggestions. This is Article 8 pertaining to land usage, Article 109 concerning the election of people's courts, Article 119 relating to the right to rest, Article 120 pertaining to material security and pensions, Article 121 on education, Article 127 about habeas corpus, 123 about military service, 135 about voting rights, and 142 about deputies' responsibilities. In Kirov, the ones that received the most suggestions are similar. For example, Article 8 of the draft Constitution brings land rights to the forefront. And so many collective farmers take advantage of the discussion to start asking for access to or ownership of resources they had traditionally used, but did not legally own. So, for example, many of them ask for eternal usage of the forest. They use the forest for hunting, for gathering wood, for building things. They also want meadows and hayfields to be turned over to the collective farms, have water rights to local streams and ponds. And again, this is not something that you would expect to be addressed within a constitution, but here we are. They also suggest that the natural resources should be denied to individual smallholders, or Yedini Lichniki, people who have individual farms, and that this land should be given to more deserving collective farmers for proper land usage. The Constitution actually does guarantee the right for Yedini Lichniki to continue to farm, which is, again, surprising given party thought on getting everyone into a collective farm. And the collective farmers are not super fond of this. Interestingly enough, neither are the local or regional officials. I wrote a chapter for Aaron Reddish's compendium from University of Toronto Press. I can't remember what it's called. About taxes and taxation. And despite the Constitution guaranteeing individual smallholders the right to exist and continue to farm, local and regional tax boards try and tax them into oblivion. And they are often punished for this, citing a violation of their constitutional rights, which I think is interesting. Because many people sort of think of the Constitution as sort of a paper document with no teeth. But certainly when it comes to taxation, local and regional officials get in trouble for violating individual smallholders' constitutional rights in regards to taxation. And some of the districts are actually forced to either return property that they had seized for back taxes or to compensate monetarily the collective farmers, or not the individual smallholders, and sometimes collective farmers, for the property or money that had been taken, or even houses that had been taken for back taxes. So that certainly does happen. Sorry about the phone. I thought it was off. And then we also look at Article 119 and 120. This is about the right to rest and the right to pensions. And specifically, the way the Constitution is written, these rights are guaranteed for workers and like white-collar workers, office workers, but not collective farmers, which is the majority of the population. And the collective farmers notice this. And they suggest that they be explicitly given the rights to have a pension from the state and the right to rest in government-funded sanatoria. Technically, what was supposed to happen is collective farms were supposed to have funds that they themselves created to help old people or people who needed to go to sanatoria on their own dime. And they really wanted the state to pay for this. They wanted collective farmers to be included in all aspects of the social welfare system and to have access to all of these state-provided services. Also, Article 121 is about education. In Kirov, the suggestions involve, for example, removing or raising age limits for matriculation into higher educational institutions, probably reflecting that many people did not have the opportunity in the Tsarist period to pursue higher education. And then there's also a concern about costs. Many people write that they wanted school supplies or textbooks to be provided by the state at the state's expense, rather than this being an expense that the family has to bear. So about habeas corpus, yeah, they're not fond of habeas corpus, which I thought was interesting. 88% of suggestions in Kirov specifically ask that criminals be allowed to be arrested without the sanctions of the procurator. And this is because there was a lot of criminality and lawlessness in the countryside. There were very few cops. The cops that were there were overwhelmed. I mean, as late as the early 1930s, in some parts of Kirov, you actually have pitched battles between bandit groups and the cops and the NKVD. And then eventually the Red Army is called in to deal with them because there is such lawlessness. So people really want stability. They want the ability for criminals to be arrested. They don't want to have to go through bureaucratic nonsense. And they don't necessarily value due process the same way. And in fairness, some of these peasants just didn't do due process. Christine Warbach has a really interesting and horrifying article about samasud, or like somewhere between like lynching and self-justice in peasant communities before the revolution, where they would just, essentially murder like horse thieves and stuff because this sort of crime threatened the safety and survival of the whole community. So they just kind of like murked the dude themselves. Like really horrific stuff, like ripping out their veins, breaking their legs, like terrifying. So peasant communities don't necessarily value due process quite the same way we do. And going back to voting rights, Article 135, people in Kirov, 83% of suggestions to Article 135 were about limiting the voting rights of former Lishenzi and cult members, so people who were part of any sort of religious group. And this is very much against what Stalin is pushing, which is for opening up the franchise, having, for the first time, no limitations on who can vote based on class or former class affiliation. People are not real fond of that, if we're going to be honest. And partially that is because the reality they are living in Kirov is very different than the reality Stalin and party leaders are living in Moscow.
You talked a lot about the way that the articles and the Constitution were written and about the responses that people were having. But could you just outline how exactly did these popular discussions and debates take place? And what was their supposed purpose, at least initially, for why they took place?
Oh, the reason they took place was to get feedback. The party and state genuinely cared about what people thought. How they were organized depends on who was doing the organization. In theory, what was supposed to happen is you were basically supposed to have study circles where people would read through the Constitution. They would discuss each article in depth. There were reading lists provided of supplementary articles about constitutional theory and communist theory that were provided in journals like Pravda or Bolshevik that you were supposed to use as supplementary material. And this was supposed to be like a graduate level seminar where people sat around and discussed and like brainstormed and wrote down these ideas. In practice, that didn't happen a whole lot because you're having these meetings after work. People are tired, they're irritated. Many of the people having these meetings simply don't have the theoretical background themselves to host such in-depth discussions. So often the discussions would simply involve someone reading the text of the Constitution out loud, asking if they had any suggestions. If they said no, they're like, okay, we can go home now. And repeatedly, regional officials are being pressured by the center to get them to go back and have real discussions, to read supplementary material, to talk about theory, to talk about communist history, to talk about economic theory, and really get people engaged. And it's a hard sell. Because a lot of these people, again, have families, they have jobs that require, long hours, and they just themselves simply do not have the education to really foster this kind of discussion. But you also have people that write letters themselves to people like Stalin, Kalinin, the Constitutional Commission. Some of them are really interesting. A lot of them are like, hi, my name is Ivan, and here's where I live, and I'm a really good communist. Some of these are reprinted in newspapers to help stimulate discussion. There's a great one about a woman who grew up in the Tsarist period, and she couldn't get educated because it was just not the thing women did at the time. But she's talking about how her kids will have a brighter future because they can go to schools and her daughters can go to college. And all of that is really true. Of course, these letters are being reproduced to, reinforce or validate the gains of the Soviet state. But these gains are also real. And I think people underestimate the amount of positive social change that comes from Soviets taking power. Women get the right to vote. Women can go to school. You have mass literacy campaigns that take semi-literate peasants into being completely literate people. You have all sorts of jobs training that's available. Help for women and children. Aaron Reddish has a great chapter that he wrote on alimony and how the courts help women and children get money from deadbeat husbands. There's a lot of really positive things that Soviet power brings to life. And they write all about this, thank you, Comrade Stalin, for, But one of my favorite letters is from a little boy in Sarapul. And he writes about like education and health and how children, need health and stuff. But what's my favorite thing about it is he simply addressed the letter to the center of Moscow and put it in the mail. And you know what? That letter got to the center of Moscow. That letter got to the Constitutional Committee. It is in the papers of the Constitutional Committee, just addressed to the center of Moscow. So people were, in many ways, very conscientious about gathering up these suggestions and materials and stuff and putting them together in these big folders and writing down all of the suggestions, even if some of them were silly, so that the party leaders could know what people really thought about it. I mean, this is a genuine effort. This is not political theater.
I liked how in the book you had mentioned that the Soviet Constitution of 1936 was in some ways meant to protect and assert the gains that the Soviet state had made just as much as it was about prescribing certain rights.
Yeah, things like codifying, collective land rights and that sort of thing. The right to rest, all of that is about codifying gains. And so is opening up the franchise. I mean, Stalin, I do believe, genuinely believes that class enemies are a thing of the past, and everybody should be allowed to vote. We no longer need the dictatorship of the proletariat. And yeah, he's wrong. He is wrong, and he gets a lot of pushback. And Getty and I have talked about this, that this might be one of the reasons you start seeing repression kick off in like 36 and 37, is because I've been through like NKVD party reports. Unfortunately, like the main NKVD files are not available for researchers at the moment, but all their party files are. And they are writing about, these enemies, religious people who are coming back from exile. Kulaks, a lot of the kulaks are coming back from exile after dekulakization. They come back in 1936. Some of them want like their houses back. They want their land back. And the regional government certainly isn't going to do this. And the districts are freaking out because a lot of their property has been transformed into things like schools or the RICOM or, some sort of government building. And also these people tend to be kind of popular. A lot of the kulaks were people who were economically very successful and had a lot of status in the pre-revolutionary village. And so they bring a lot of that back, and they are seen as, by Rayon level people, as legitimate rivals to power. In Kirov, you see a lot of priests and religious figures come back as well. And some of them, since they now have the constitutional right, they stand for election and they win posts in like the rural Soviet. And this causes massive freak out among the lower level communists. And in fairness to the lower level communists, 1920s and 1930s in the village was rough. So rough. A lot of communists were subject to physical violence. They were attacked. They were murdered. I think in one of the things I've written, I can't remember which one, I include like information about a guy who was a tax collector, and he remembers like being stalked through the woods by bandits. The murder of Selkori, rural correspondents who would dime out anti-Soviet or anti-party activity in the village was very, very real. People would take shots through like the RICOM secretary's window. So, this is a very legitimate threat to them, and they're not cool with it. Soviet power in the countryside is still pretty tenuous, and they are really not cool with re-enfranchising and re-empowering these elements that they see as harmful. And certainly things like the increased taxes against former lishency and individual smallholders is a way to sort of circumvent Stalin's decision to re-enfranchise them, because if you cripple them economically, they have to go away. And it is clear in Kirov, at least, that they get the tacit approval of the Oblast Исполнительная Komitet, so that'd be the Oblast Executive Committee. Bobkov kind of gives them like the nod to like jack the taxes up and give them extra taxes as a way to try and break the back of these politically suspect groups. But you also see at the time the NKVD is writing a lot of these reports about these groups coming back, about them standing for election, about them committing violence. And this is what they're sending to Moscow. And in fairness to Stalin, he holds out for quite some time. Arch and I have talked about this, but Stalin holds out for multi-candidate elections and re-enfranchisement of political lishency up until about December, when it's just no longer viable because of all the pushback and all of the negative reports coming from the countryside about enemies. Are they exaggerating this to get what they want? In some cases, probably yes, because in some cases it's clear it's like the same 3 incidents or 5 incidents that they keep writing about. But I think that for many of these people, the concern is legitimate. And to me, it mirrors Stalin's dizzy with success, where he decides early in collectivization that they're going to access that the collectivization has been a little too much. We need to like back off, decollectivize a little bit, take a breath. And many of the local activists really hate this policy and they feel betrayed by the party and state that they have been out there, again, risking their lives. This is legitimate. People would like jump them in the woods and murder them. And they feel betrayed by this backing off. So, these kinds of policies are not always super popular at a grassroots level.
It's interesting how Stalin was trying to hold out on this idea that the class enemies had been defeated, and he ends up having to respond to the bottom up pushback from the regions and from the ground and have to make a concession in order to make sure that the system functions.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at repression and stuff, a lot of the mass operations too are done at a local level. And it is actually the locals who frequently come back to Moscow and ask to raise the quotas because they found even more problematic people. And the thing is, when we talk about repression, there's several different operations going on. So there's technically several different repressions happening at the same time. And this is really what I'm talking about here is mass repression, the mass repression and anti-kulak and anti-religious operations. The ones that tended to go through the extrajudicial organs like Troika. But that tends to be grassroots when you look at it.
But this is also like similar to the Caucasus region, where before the Russian Revolution, workers are told, like they're trying, like party workers, like Bolsheviks, are trying to tell workers to stop taking revenge and killing their bosses, sort of like a slightly less violent campaign. So it kind of fits in a similar trajectory, I guess, where the grassroots is a lot more militant than the leadership. I mean, for me, this is like a really fascinating topic. What that looked like, the kind of, is it like, did you find a lot of these letters in the archives of what?
Oh, God, yeah. Yes, there's entire fondy of just like letters. I mean, that's one of the reasons I had to pick a regional focus is because there are literally thousands of them. And there's also like printed swodki where like the obkom or the obispolikom would gather up all of the suggestions and type them out and then send them in big bound volumes to Moscow to look at as well. So there's letters within Kirov that were written to Kirovskaya Pravda and then end up as part of like these swodki that get sent to Moscow. But there's plenty of letters that are written to the Constitutional Committee in Moscow itself, or to Stalin or Kalinin, or any sort of head of government or state that they can think of. Stalin and Kalinin tend to be the big two because Stalin's head of the party and Kalinin's head of state. And Kalinin is also a peasant, so he's a very popular figure for peasants to write to.
When you say people got voting rights the first time, can you tell us who they're voting for? Like, what are they voting for exactly?
Well, in 1937, you have the elections to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. So they are voting for candidates to the Supreme Soviet for sure. But they're also voting for things like rural Soviets. And that's one of the complaints that you do see in Kirov is that they want local officials to be more responsive to their constituency. And one of the problems is that most people don't have a really good mode of transport. Mostly it's your feet, maybe a horse, maybe a bicycle. But one of the complaints is they want to make like the rural Soviets in Rayoni smaller because they want to be able to walk to the center and file paperwork and it not be a huge, ridiculous, like 3-day journey. But yeah, rural Soviets, district level officials. And I guess maybe that's one thing people don't understand is these are not party elections. These are all state elections. The only people who can vote in party elections are party members, and that is a closed election, and often at this period in time also done by secret ballot. But these are state positions that you are voting for.
I'm going to go back a little bit, but I found it really important that the collective farms did not want to be responsible for the pensions and all the other like social costs that they had to bear, that they would rather have the state be responsible for it. Do you think that sort of like that gave it direction to a much more sort of state-centric development than what was maybe originally thought of, more collective farms and a lot more decentralized in that sense?
I think for the collective farmers, it's about having full citizenship rights. They think, why should we have to pay for this stuff for ourselves when workers and white collar workers get it from the government? And there were also serious issues about things happening to these funds. There's a huge scandal in Sarapul again, where the district government comes in and takes the pension and mutual aid fund for some sort, I think it's back taxes or something, but they illegally seized these funds from the collective farmers, leaving them with no money. Eventually, these people are arrested, and I do believe they are actually executed as enemies of the people. But there are real concerns by collective farmers, too, that these funds can be embezzled, they can be misused. Certainly there are issues with collective farm chairmen and stuff spending collective farm funds on alcohol, honey, cheese, sausages, parties, wine for his friends. When I write about collective farms, the functioning of a collective farm is often very dependent on whether or not the chairman drinks a lot. If he drinks a lot, you're probably in trouble, because there is definitely a correlation between alcoholism and embezzlement. And I think they're also concerned about embezzling of these funds, because they are managed by district officials and collective farm officials, and that is a serious concern. Whereas pensions from the central government are much less likely to be embezzled.
So there's more trust in the central government than local government or local.
Oh God, yes. God, yes. They are way more likely to trust Stalin than their local rural Soviet chairman. Of course, they also know the local rural Soviet chairman, and they've seen him get drunk and run through town and start fist fights. So there is a reason that they don't trust him. A lot of these people were not particularly good at their jobs.
What kinds of interventions into the historiography of the Soviet Union do you think your investigation made?
Well, I guess the most obvious one is that Stephen Cohen asserts that Bukharin was largely responsible for drafting the Constitution, and that just appears to not be true at all. Bukharin was a member of the Constitutional Committee. He was on the Rights Subcommission, but it does not appear that he was a major player in drafting it. So the way the Constitution was written is the subcommissions, who had various chairs. Stalin handled general questions, Molotov handled economics, et cetera, they all wrote up rough drafts of what they wanted their section to say, and then it was all given to Yakovlev, Stetsky, and Paul, who drafted a first draft that went to Stalin, who made changes on 3 different occasions and went back and forth with Yakovlev, Stetsky, and Paul about what should be in the Constitution. But it was interesting. I actually got to hold Stalin's edits. Thank God somebody typed them. He has horrible handwriting. And I've heard this from David Brandenburger, too, who writes about Stalin's writing of the short course. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't want to read the short course. That is so fucking boring. But yeah, so it was really interesting to see Stalin's edits and, the different back and forth dialogue between him and Yakovlev, Stetsky, and Tal about the formation of the Constitution. But it does appear that it is really a Stalin Constitution. Stalin was very, very involved in the drafting and the editing of the Constitution. So that, I guess, is sort of the big historiographical thing. The other thing that does get me pushback is the idea that the Soviet Union was serious about participatory politics, that they were serious about having people vote, having them participate in elections, having people have a voice. And, this, of course, countermands sort of the traditional Cold War view of the Soviet Union. And certainly some German guy whose name I can't remember wrote a very nasty review about me in German about how I was just terribly naive, and it ended up being more of an ad hominem attack than a critique of my book. Which I did not appreciate, but I assume most people don't read German, so I'm not overly concerned. And I don't even remember this guy's name, so clearly not that important. But yeah, I think that people need to take more seriously that these projects were done in earnest. And I also think that regional history allows you to decentralize things, to look at regionally specific aspects. Kirov is great. Kirov is great for many reasons, but their archives are great because we are beyond the pale of evacuation. A lot of stuff, I actually started my research in Kiev, and there's almost nothing left because of the Nazis. Everything just got destroyed. But everything is in Kirov. They kept everything. And this is good because there are just so many random pieces of paper that I have read that contain fun little tidbits. But also, Kirov is kind of marginal. So Moscow doesn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to what we do here. Even now, Kirov isn't overly important. And that allows people a lot more wiggle room when it comes to administration and what local officials and regional officials can do. And it also means, for example, that a lot of our repression starts later. A lot of it doesn't start until 1938. And the majority of communist leaders who are arrested as enemies of the people are actually released in Kirov, probably because our start is late. And they go right back to work, which is awkward, I'm sure. Sometimes in the same organization that kicked them out and arrested them as an enemy of the people.
Why is writing of the Constitution and repression so close to each other?
Well, because they occur at the same time.
So what is the link between them in that sense?
You mean temporally or
just like connection with it? Like, is there any link to it that?
Oh yeah, I mean, Arch and I have certainly discussed this, Arch Getty, that it is likely that the Constitution and the opening up of franchise, the removing of limits from former class enemies, really did spark a pushback from the regions, and all of these negative reports about enemies and kulaks and religious leaders coming back and taking over power in the village helped spark some of the repression that we see in 1937, 1938. It is also weird because at least 3 members of the Constitutional Committee, Chubar, Bukharin, and Radek are also, or Akulov, are actually repression victims too. But weirdly enough, they don't rewrite the Constitution until the Brezhnev period, so I guess they're okay with their writings, even though like Bukharin's books and stuff are pulled off of shelves. So it's weird. But a lot of Soviet history is weird. A lot of history in general is weird.
So the Constitution is written, it's adopted. How is it implemented? Does it actually, in practice, exist as Constitution?
Yeah, it exists. Like I said, I wrote an article for a chapter for a book for Aaron Reddish from a book that came through University of Toronto. God, I can't remember the name. Oh, I think it's called like something like the Phantom something. It reminds me of the first Star Wars movie. I'm terrible with names. I'm sorry. But when it comes to like tax policy and stuff and overtaxing individual smallholders and then sometimes collective farmers as well, yeah, the Constitution is used to justify firing the people who overtax people, on occasion arresting them for violations of Soviet legality, and returning property and money to people who had too many taxes implemented, which I thought was interesting, that they actually are mandated to return property or money that was seized for back taxes that were above and beyond the taxes they should have been given. So certainly in that aspect, it exists. And as I said, it does appear also that the arrests of NKVD people who were abusive towards prisoners is also couched in language about violating socialist legality and constitutional rights.
So there is a due process in some ways.
Yeah, it just sometimes takes a while to get there. I mean, I have people in Kirov that are arrested as enemies of the people, probably beaten up. In some cases, definitely beaten up. In one case, the guy falls out of a second-story window. Did he jump? Was he pushed? It's not exactly clear. He doesn't remember because he has a concussion and broken bones. But these cases of the party people, they work through the legal system. They go to the regional court. They go to the military tribunals. They are appealed to the Supreme Court of the USSR. And eventually, at least in Kirov, the majority of them are reversed. The charges are dropped. People are acquitted. They are restored to party membership. So yeah, the wheels of justice are slow and messy, and not everybody makes it through. But in many cases, yeah, there is due process and it works. But I mean, in fairness, if you look at the US justice system, it's also messy and iffy on many occasions, too. I think it is important to keep in mind that the Soviets do view constitutionalism and constitutional rights very differently than we're traditionally taught in sort of liberal democracies, and that we probably shouldn't judge it on the same criteria, and that we certainly shouldn't think of it quite the same way. You know, like traditional rights like freedom of speech and stuff are nice, but you can't eat them, you can't house your family in them. And I do believe that Stalin actually has a point when he says if you don't have the material conditions to realize your rights, are they really worth anything? And I think that's something that is certainly worth thinking about in modern politics, where you have things like means of communication becoming increasingly private companies controlled by a handful of right-leaning billionaires. I mean, the most obvious example would be Twitter, X, whatever the hell we're calling it now, and Elon Musk's crazy bullshit. But even things like Facebook and stuff, and like transferring the ability to, your speech platforms to private companies where you don't have the same protections. Like, do you still have freedom of speech if you don't have a platform? Things like Citizens United. Is money speech? Can companies make speech by spending money? This is how we have the resources to realize our rights, is certainly something, worth thinking about.